It was when I went hitchhiking as a teenager that I first read the New Testament. On that occasion, the driver who picked me up was a Christian, and we got talking. He said if I wanted to find out about God, I should read the Gospels.
I wasn't travelling through the Egyptian desert at the time. I was actually on my way down to Exeter, hitching along the A303. But it was a turning point. And when I got home, I read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I think really it was John that struck a chord with me, with its deep sense of Christian mystery, and its poetry, and its mysticism.
That day was the first step on a journey that led to my ordination as a priest in the Church of England. But what I didn't know then was that these Gospels were only a fraction of the information we have about Jesus. In fact, over the last century, discoveries here in the Egyptian deserts have revealed that in the first 400 years after Jesus' death, there were in existence more than 20 Gospels, 15 apocalypses, and nearly 50 other texts about Jesus. So why do we only know of the ones in the New Testament? This is the story of a battle of words that spread across continents, that led to intrigue, forgery, condemnation. A battle in which texts fought against each other for acceptance in a fledgling faith. And what was at stake was the kind of faith that Christianity would turn out to be.
If the Gospel of Peter had won out, Christians today might believe that Jesus never died. If the Gospel of Philip had won, Mary Magdalene might have been hailed as the first pope. If the infancy narrative of James had been accepted, I would have learned in Sunday school that a child called Jesus caused his teacher to wither on the spot just for reprimanding him in class. In fact, if any of the different texts had ended up in the New Testament, Christianity today would look very different, or perhaps it wouldn't have survived at all.
The New Testament, four Gospels, letters by the Apostles Paul, Peter and James, and the book of Revelation. It's a collection of texts that our society has taken utterly for granted as the books that form the basis of Christianity.
Certainly this apparently perfectly ordered set of texts are those I've had to absorb. I've had to study since becoming a priest in the Church of England. But throughout all my theological training and all the conversations I've had with other priests and Christian academics, we've never really discussed, I never really knew about the countless other books that didn't make it into the New Testament.
This film is the story of my journey to uncover this treasure trove of lost literature, and through it, the very different forms of Christianity it represents. What I've discovered through them is a religion far removed from the sanguine, organized movement I believed it to be. These lost Gospels were discarded by early church fathers as heretical, and they were left out of the New Testament. But I've come to believe that without them, we can't begin to understand the origins of the Christian church. These texts have reawakened in me a new fascination in Christianity and shown me what an extraordinary place the early church must have been. My journey begins in Egypt. The metropolis of Alexandria was home to Athanasius, one of the most powerful and colourful Christian bishops in history, who lived and worked in the city in the 4th century AD. Described by one contemporary as a man whose face was radiant with intelligence, he wrote every year to all the Christians under his jurisdiction to tell them when to celebrate Easter. But in his 39th letter, written in 367 AD, he had something more controversial to say.
What Athanasius included in his letter was a list, but not just any list. He named the 27 books which we now know make up the canon of New Testament scripture. And he made it clear, he made it very clear, that it was these and only these that the church approved of as scripture. Any other book, he said, should not be read.
At a single stroke, he condemned a wealth of literature that had, up until that point, been regarded as Christian. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were permitted, but those of Mary, Philip, and Peter were condemned.
The Acts of the Apostles was considered to be educational, but the Acts of Thecla were shunned. The first and second letters of Paul to the Corinthians were allowed, but I'm afraid the third one didn't make it.
Athanasius' edict was remarkable because it was the first time anyone in the top echelons of the church hierarchy had suggested that only certain books would be tolerated.
And for nearly 2,000 years, those texts at the bishop band remained a complete mystery to us. Really, all we had was scant references to them, found in the writings of their enemies, the early church fathers, who only mentioned them purely to condemn them and to warn his congregation of the erroneous teachings they contained.
And perhaps this might have remained the case if it wasn't for a chance find in December 1945, a discovery that forced scholars to completely rethink the nature of early Christianity. "300 miles south of Cairo, close to the Nile, is an area called Nagamadi. It's an extraordinary place, made more so by what was found buried here just over 60 years ago. A library of papyri books containing more than 50 individual works from early Christianity, the majority previously unknown. I've come here with Professor Bart Ehrman, who's devoted the last 30 years to studying this period of history.
Well, this is where they discovered the manuscripts. There were 7 farmhands from the nearby village of Al-Qasar who were out digging for sabak, which is nitrate-rich soil in this area that they use for fertilizer. The 7 of them were digging near one of these boulders, and one of them hit something in the ground and uncovered it, and it turned out it was a skeleton. Next to the skeleton, they found a jar. An earthenware jar, reddish color, that stood about 2 feet high.
What was in it?
And the jar was, they didn't know at first because the jar was sealed, in fact. There was a bowl over the top, and they were afraid to open the jar because they thought there might be an evil genie inside. And then after some reflection, they realized there might be gold inside, and so they smashed into it with their mattocks. And there wasn't gold or genie. There were some codices, some books.
The books form the most significant collection of lost Christian writings. The manuscripts date from the 4th century, but some scholars believe they may have been composed much earlier. They include several Gospels about Jesus. But the man they describe is unrecognizable from the Jesus found in the traditional books of the New Testament. This was a Jesus who didn't die, who took revenge on his enemies, and who kissed Mary Magdalene on the mouth. These were shocking and challenging texts, never before seen by a Western scholar. And although it was known they'd existed in antiquity, they'd been lost for nearly 1,500 years.
What these documents show us is that in the early centuries, in the 100 or 200 years after Jesus died, there were alternative visions of what Jesus was all about and what Christianity was supposed to be, different understandings of who God was, or even how many gods there were. And most of these documents claim to be representing the views of Jesus himself. And so these provide us with an alternative vision of what Jesus himself might have actually taught during his public ministry.
So why did these books end up buried here? Well, scholars believe they came from a nearby monastery from the 4th century, now in ruins. The texts may well have belonged to the monks who lived here. And when Bishop Athanasius issued his stern edict, they should have got rid of those books, deemed heretical.
But they couldn't bring themselves to destroy them, perhaps because they found wisdom and consolation in their words. So they simply buried them, in order that they might be uncovered again some other day.
There's even a rumor that the skeleton found with the scrolls belonged to a slave ordered by the monks to carry the 13 books to their burial place, and then murdered to prevent him from revealing their secret. Despite the monks' best efforts to protect their texts, ironically it was after their discovery by the Bedouin farmers in 1945 that they nearly didn't survive.
Having found the papyri, the ringleader Ali ripped them up to divide them between his companions. When they showed no interest, he wrapped them in his turban and took them home. When he got there, he threw them into a courtyard which was reserved for animals. To make matters worse, his mother used some of the brittle leaves that evening to start a fire for the family meal. It's a miracle they survived at all.
But survive they did, and one way or another the texts found their way north to the safety of one of Egypt's most respected museums. This is the Coptic Museum, and it's here that the Nag Hammadi scrolls are now housed.
This is fantastic.
Yeah, it really is.
I want to find out just what it was about them that made the leaders of the early church feel it was necessary to condemn them as heresy.
Coptic stonework.
My companion is the distinguished Coptologist Stephen Emmel, who spent over 30 years conserving and studying the texts. Amongst the manuscripts found were many fragments of Gospels not included in the New Testament. One such text is the Gospel of Thomas, unusual because it was discovered in its entirety. It's attributed to, although not proven to be, the work of one of Jesus' disciples, famous in the New Testament as Doubting Thomas. He's the apostle who refused to believe in Jesus' resurrection until he saw it for himself. The Gospel penned in his name is a collection of 114 sayings ascribed to Jesus, written in Coptic, the Egyptian language from the beginning of the Christian period. Its style and central message is very different from that found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It begins here. This is the subtitle to the previous work. And then a new work begins. These are the secret words that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote them down. And then what follows in the Gospel is simply a series of sayings of Jesus. Most of them are introduced with the simple phrase, Jesus said. But there is no narrative framework. There's no mention of his death, no mention of his resurrection. Rather, it's things that Jesus said, puzzling things, and the point is for the reader to understand them, to think, not simply to believe.
So are the sayings from Thomas similar to the ones that we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Many of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are identical with sayings that we find in the New Testament Gospels. Some of them are completely new. Perhaps the most famous is at the very end of the Gospel of Thomas, which we have here. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary go away from us, because women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "Behold, I will lead her so that she might become male, so that she might become also a living spirit, like you males. Because any woman who makes herself male will go into the kingdom of the heavens. Now that